I was executive sous chef in a restaurant in Delhi, and my every day used to start with inspecting all the ingredients which used to come to our restaurant, and then work all day with those ingredients. And by evening or at night, I was talking to all the vendors or and having arguments from halfway around the world about cheese, about meat qualities, and all that. And like most of my days used to be completely invested in this. So I realized that I have also a unique quality to understand and understand these ingredients and understand what is the best way to like put it in a dish or to make something. uh, I also realized that I was having a dissatisfaction because though I was constantly dealing with edamame from organic farms or of the truffle from all over the world, and like like New Zealand meat chop, Australian lamb chop, and all these things when I was doing, but I didn't have anybody to talk about, say, 10 varieties of the banana that grows in Tamil Nadu. That those things also I was figuring out, but I could talk to my peer and other people about many things, about truffle, about cheese, about wine, but I could not talk about these 10 different varieties of banana. And like these kind of things was creating a kind of dissatisfaction about the whole understanding about the food we have.
Hi, I'm Shalini. For me, that diversity that Anusha is talking about has always been the cornerstone of my worldview. I worked for many years as an editor in a publishing house. There also, unheard voices, the very personal stories from personal locations, also the kinds of experiences that you don't find in Indian writing in English that you can only get via translation from regional languages. These were the things I would focus on in my commissioning and in the books I edited. Also, as a queer feminist, it is very important to me throughout to center the diversity of genders, the diversity of sexual orientations that are possible. Um, Given this, then I also found that I have read and learned enough to understand that ecological biodiversity is really the basis, the foundation on which almost all of human health, wealth, happiness, nutrition, all of these things are built on that foundation, that diverse foundation. So when it finally came time for me to also think about food, it made sense to focus on the diversity that is available on our plate. And by that I don't just mean diversity in terms of cultural experiences, like cultural influences, like okay, food from different regions or different parts of the world. I also don't only mean diversity in terms of nutrition, like we talk about having a balanced diet and how the food should have all the different uh, parts to keep us healthy. I'm actually very interested in the biodiversity that is rapidly vanishing from our plates over time. As we all over the world, we start eating the same sorts of foods. This ties into my larger questions, the ones I always ask, which is whose voices are not heard, whose food is not shown, what doesn't appear on social media, um, and also why don't we?
I was getting obsessed with this whole idea of where our food is coming from. Is there a possibility that we know that where our food is coming from? We know the faces behind this. We know the stories behind it. Because that is the only way we get connected. Otherwise, we are constantly alienated from our food, our day-to-day life. So I was also trying to come up with a business model where I actually put this whole idea inside the business model. It's not outside the business model. Uh, and that is the paradigm shift that we were planning to do.
So Edible Archives is now, among other things, also an ingredient-driven restaurant based in Goa. Our theory is actually quite simple but completely game-changing. we say that everything that you've ever eaten in your life gets archived as part of your body and is accessed only through memory. So whenever you eat something, you're not just building your own memories, but you're also creating a collective memory, a collective edible archive of all the food that has been eaten in your area. Um, in this case, then when you come to edible archives and eat at a restaurant, this means that you are getting a chance to eat some of the rare and vanishing indigenous ingredients that have been eaten in India for centuries, but are beginning to vanish not just from our plates, but from the farms and the fields where they used to grow.
Also, I was trying to understand that food is also very much part of our identity. Our identity is always driven by aspiration, and how the aspirations of food has changed after this boom of social media. And can we put that aspiration also within the business plan? I'll just explain how. Because what is happening that everybody who is like even in a small village, they are now exposed to social media. Now social media is not definitely, it's a global thing. So you are exposed to food from all over India. So you are visualizing your food in a different way, and there your everyday food is very mundane. So how to you are not interested in your everyday food anymore. You want to aspire to those food. Those are the aspirations. And so if you are not interested, also the traditional way of learning or the transmission of indigenous knowledge is lost somewhere. So we wanted to connect these two dots, that if we also do something where all this transmission of indigenous knowledge is there in the food, but it comes up in a kind of a visual narrative of a social media narrative that you are getting. So say I'll give you a very simple example. So we do something called a pumpkin kokum rolled rice in our restaurant, where it looks like sushi, and but all the ingredients is there. There is nothing actually which is like sushi other than the visual aspect of it. So the rice is an indigenous rice from Manipur. The kokum is from North Karnataka, and pumpkin is from either our farm or the farm next door. But when you see the visual narrative of it, you are actually in par with your social media narrative.
So let's talk about the back end of things a little bit also, the business end of things. Restaurants run on notoriously low margins. The entire food and beverage industry is basically built on balancing ingredient quality, reliability of procurement against the price you have to pay for these things. Now, the way most people do it, and the way that, say, Onmitra has also done it for many years, has been that you work with professional vendors. The professional part of this is that they undertake to provide you decent quality ingredients, but reliably. Like in terms of either that they won't go bad, or that it won't fall apart halfway through, it will come on time, all of those sorts of things, and a basic level of quality. But then naturally at every point you are compromising on very, very good quality. We decided, when we decided to set up Edible Archives, right from the beginning, we baked this into our plan from the beginning, that we will prioritize ingredient quality first of all, and focus on indigenous ingredients as much as possible. So to do these things, we decided, rather than working with professional vendors, we will deal directly with the growers who are growing the food. Now this means that we still have to make compromises, but in other directions. This can mean sometimes that we have to compromise on cost, sometimes it means that we have to compromise on reliability and the fact that we actually get the ingredients on time or in the way that we want to. So why did we choose such a?
A short answer to this is that we want to build a community. Why we want to build a community? There are a long-term business goal which is attached to building a community. Because one is that if you have a community, or if you are making a sustainable relationship, that assure you for a long-term quality. Uh, so you get to have a relationship, and they know you, you know them, and they assure your quality. Secondly, that it can give you some in crisis situation, it can have a very interesting outcome which can help you in a very different way. So what happened during the pandemic, when we were again trying to start our business with takeaway and caterings and all these things, most of the restaurants were not getting the resources, because the vendors were not short on resources and all. And what we realized then, that, like, I'll give you an example. So I have a small fisherman, like a fisherman who has a small boat and get things for like in that, in an individual this thing. He also has couple of breadfruit trees, and during lockdown that helped us so much that we were getting fish, as long as he had the breadfruit tree with full of breadfruit, whenever we needed he was giving us breadfruit. So this kind of thing can only come from a sustainable relationship. The third thing, which is another very important thing in our business, that when you have this kind of a relationship, that can give you an unexpected result. So recently I visited one of the farmers who we work with, and he told me that during the pandemic he was working with his rice fields, and he came up with a new rice which he got through natural selection, and it's an amazing rice which he has not put it in the market yet, and he wanted to show me, because I worked with rice for many years. He wanted to show me about the quality and about all these things. And then I got in my hand a very unique rice which I can do lot of things with, and this only came because I have a relationship with this person who which is a qualitative relationship.
So, of course, all of this means a lot of resources go into this. This kind of a deep human engagement, this kind of this it takes a lot of time. Sometimes it takes money also. Very often it takes the time means also things like travel. It means going and taking time away from the restaurant, specifically to go and spend time with various people, and those things have their attendant costs. But the whole point about a sustainable business, I feel, and we set it up this way, is that unlike traditional businesses where input X should always be matched by output Y, we look at it differently. So I'll give you an example. A few years ago, about 5 years ago, we were working with a farmer. He had some very interesting rice, and we asked him that in your next harvest, after the rain, when you harvest the rice, you please give us all of your rice. And we gave him money in advance for the rice, as well as like how to ship it, etc., all of those costs. The rain passed, several months passed. Eventually it became quite clear that we were not going to. But we kept in touch with him. We asked him about what he's planning to plant. We checked in about how the rains were that season. We asked about his family, all the usual ways in which we stay in touch and have an engagement with the people we work with. We continued with this person. A year after that year, so we didn't get anything that we paid for the first year. We didn't also ask him to give anything the next year. We didn't get anything back in return either. The year after that, he sent us some rice. He also told us about a neighbor who was growing a different kind of indigenous rice, one that we never heard about before. And through him, we got to know about that and got in touch with other people who were growing those kinds of rice. Over the next couple of years, we wound up buying a lot of things from him. He's also we've got oils. We've talked to him about honey. All kinds of things. So now, on the one hand, the 10,000 rupees that we paid for that original batch of rice, we had to write off. But on the other hand, the 10,000 rupees is actually not just on the other side of the ledger. It's not just X kilos of rice. It is also this relationship that we have built over 5 years, plus however many years it will continue to go. So that is how we look at it. We've changed our perception of accounting also entirely in how we do it.
I'll just take this thing from Shalini, and I'll explain that how in the business model we are actually putting like our resources and R&D goes hand in hand. So, say I'll give you an example again that say I really like the French salt flour gel, and I have been using it, and but when we moved to Goa, I also realized that there are so many people who are like they have salt pans in Goa. So what we did in last 2 years, we did a massive study in all the salt pans, and then gradually realized that there is also like you get a very interesting salt which generally gets mixed up with other salt, but we worked with that farmer, and then we realized that in the March of May, where there is like really a hot sun, and the top layer of salt from a particular couple of salt pans gives you an amazing salt which can actually be like as good as all the like salt that you're buying from
The
abroad,
imported.
the imported
Yeah.
ones and the expensive ones.
Yeah.
But it really doesn't mean that we are not buying expensive things. So another example I'll give you so to understand. So again, generally what happens in India, the sushi rice we buy in India, which mostly comes from California, by the way, and that sushi rice we in F&B we happily pay for 250 rupees to 300 rupees per kg. But but what we have found in last few years, that in Sundarban and also in Northeast, you get some of the sticky rice which can be used as a sushi rice, but they are grown in very small amount, and they don't have you can't get it like the productivity and how you ship it and get it. There is not a very well developed vendor relationship around it. But so we worked on that, and now we buy those rice, but it's not cheap. They are very expensive because they are grown in very small quantities. So we pay maybe around the same price, which is unheard in Indian context, that you are paying for a
300
rice
rupees
300
for-
rupees
yeah.
for 1 kg of rice. But we are assuring quality and uniqueness, and also this gives you a like a long term effect on sustainability, because when you are actually like encouraging them to grow it, and that rice is grown, even if we are buying it like, or some other people are buying it, it's grown for which was maybe endangered, maybe
Yeah.
people were thinking how they were just growing it for themselves, but suddenly because of that, it's not a boom again. It's that they are suddenly doing it in a huge, large scale. We also keep an eye on what quantity we are consuming, but definitely it's giving them this thing to
A market for what they were already willing to produce.
yeah.
Yeah. So then I think another aspect of a sustainable business is that you have to, when we talk about community building, you also have to incorporate qualitatively and quantitatively the cultural context of the ingredients that you're talking about. So again, as an example, we sometimes serve blended rice in our restaurant, which is something that most people don't talk about, or if it is at all mentioned, it's usually seen as a bad thing, that it's almost like adulteration of rice. Like if somebody were to tell you that I'm giving you a mix of basmati and something, you will think that they are defrauding you or they're trying to cut corners. But what we found is we were traveling in Manipur, and one very old lady told us that when she was growing up, they used to eat mostly only blended rice, and this was the first time we'd heard about it.
And we
Then-
ate it, and we
we
went
ate
and
it,
we
yeah,
ate it.
yeah. Then a couple of years later, we were in Hong Kong, and we found more or less by accident, but we heard that near Wan Chai market there used to be another market over there that sold only blends of rice. All the traders there used to blend their rice according to various logics, like for this
There is
kind
a
of
grammar
rice.
to
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
There is a grammar
Yeah.
in this blending.
Yes, that this kind of rice blends with that kind of rice, or does not blend with another kind of rice, and it is used for specific purposes. But this entire thing has vanished. You can't find any of those blended rice in and around Wan Chai market, and mostly people have also forgotten that there used to be a way of blending rice, or what were the details. So when we went back to Manipur after that, we asked the same lady about it, and it became clear. We asked a lot of people actually about it, not just her. It became clear that though there was nothing like this one-child market for blended rice in Manipur, definitely a lot of people used to eat blended rice, and one of the major examples is that various types of black rice were eaten only as blends.
Other than dessert.
Other than dessert. Like if you were eating them as rice, right? Like as rice that you're eating as a meal, it was always eaten blended with other kinds of rice. So when we asked about it, they said that actually black rice is not good for you on its own. It's too heavy, it's too strong, it's not
Too heavy to digest.
It puts strain on your body to digest it. So it has all kinds of health benefits, but only if you eat it in a blend with other rice. So prior to that, we at Edible Archives, we have done a couple of bowls of rice where we have black rice on its own, different types of black rice, 2 or 3 different types of black rice. We have done them on their own. Now, after hearing this and finding out about this, we never serve black rice on its own as part of our meal. We only serve it as a blend. So we also incorporate the cultural context of the people who have been growing these and consuming these rices, and we also make it a point to tell everybody about this, because it is also important not to in like the present time when a lot of food is basically like a lot of food knowledge comes through various fads. It's also important to let people know that there was a logic to how things were eaten before, and not to only follow fads blindly.
So we want to end by telling the crux of our business model. So how we conceptualized it is that we took all the traditional business models of F&B because they are built on on thousands of inputs from very intelligent people. But what we did was that we also figured out that what we are good at, and then we put all those things inside one of those business models or a couple of business models, and then made it our own. That is then completely our business model. And because it is our business model, which is built on the traditional one and our inputs from our good part of like what we know the best, then that gives us also a lot of flexibility and a space to innovate.
Yeah, and we certainly saw this when it came to the COVID lockdown, because we felt, in fact, because we didn't have such a rigid structure with such like unmovable goals to aim for, we had the freedom to be more creative in our approach to such an unprecedented situation.
Also, like when I used to work in Japan, I have heard this a couple of times from many business people that trust is the base of our business. I can understand then, but now when we work with a community, or we understand that if there is trust in the relationship with some long-term goal, you can achieve something which you cannot otherwise imagine.
Yeah, and that is the whole thing about the community. It is not about struggle or competition or one-upping each other. It is also that anybody's success in the community has a butterfly effect on everybody's success. So we all work together, we all grow together,
Thrive together.
And the whole point is that we have to be able to trust not just each other, but trust ourselves, and innovate according to what we know we can do, rather than only blindly copying models that are set.